Right, welcome everyone to this very fantastic session. It's really amazing. I'm very excited about the opportunity to introduce this session. Today is World Poverty Day, and the history. Actually, the day has quite a rich history. Around 100,000 plus people gathered in Paris, France, in 1987, I think, and they were protesting against the plight of the poor people. They were saying that it is not possible that a world as rich as it is should not have so much poverty happening. And eventually, in 1992, the United Nations General Assembly came together and established October 17 to be a day where this is recognized officially, and kind of trying to bring together all the different perspectives, solutions to how this problem can be solved. Today, our event is titled Beyond the Breadline, Actionable Steps to End Poverty Now. So it's just to remind us that poverty is not just about a lack of income or lack of resources, but also the lack of opportunity, lack of inclusion, and also just kind of lack of dignity in general. Across the world, we have made measurable progress, but we also have many challenges. So from economic shocks and inflation to conflict, climate change, etc. And all of these things calls for very deep reflection so that we can be able to take bold, decisive action for the days ahead. And to unpack all of these issues, we have two fantastic panelists, very distinguished colleagues. We have Professor Dr. Akansh Khandelwal, an assistant professor at the Jindal School of Banking and Finance. He will discuss a lot of recent developments and sometimes the lack of recent developments in global poverty reduction and measurement, etc. And we also have Professor Dr. Prachi Bansal, an assistant professor in the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. And she will also be discussing issues on food security, inflation, inequality, etc. So to start off with, I'll introduce our first panelist. This is Professor Akansh. Professor Akansh Khandelwal is an assistant professor of economics at the Jindal School of Banking and Finance. He holds a PhD in economics from the Indian Institute of Management, Indore. His research focuses on development economics and public policy, with special emphasis on poverty, inequality, labor markets, and environmental justice. And he has previously worked with the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS, IIMA Ventures, and as a policy consultant for organizations like the Global Village Foundation and Outline India on many World Bank-supported projects. And his teaching and research explore how evidence-based policy and impact evaluation can drive inclusive growth. So I will invite everyone to listen reflectively and let us think, very deeply about the subjects as I hand it over to our first panelist.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jason, for your generous introduction. So I'll just quickly start. I hope my screen is visible to everyone, right? My screen is visible, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. So just to begin, I'll just start with some stylized facts about poverty right now, like something that is quite popular over the last few days, which basically hits the headlines of the World Bank reports and all of the different reports, basically. So one thing is clear, and everybody agrees to that. There is no contention about it, no confusion about it as such, that global poverty has fallen. And it's something that we congratulate ourselves again and again, pat our backs that, okay, we have achieved certain, actually quite a lot over the past few years, over the last 3-4 decades, in which there has been some improvement in poverty eradication, right? Some improvement in some achievements in poverty eradication. So we find that if you use different measures for poverty eradication, the first is generally we are measuring poverty using non-monetary measures. And we find that when we take into account non-monetary measures, which is a little contentious because some people believe that it is not capturing the poverty in its entirety, we find that there has been a 1.1 billion people who are sorry, not 1.1, this 831 million who are below poverty line, or only that much, not more than that. Earlier it used to be much higher, but now there are only 831 million, which is about 10% of the entire population who are below poverty line, number one. And I'll just talk about poverty line in a while. Second thing that we find when we take about the non-monetary measures, then we find that 1.1 billion people are living in multidimensional poverty, because it includes access to electricity, access to clean drinking water, education, health, etc., etc. All these factors are taken into account. By that, because it's more multidimensional in its nature, we see that definitely it's not 831 million, but it's more than that. More people are living under multidimensional poverty, which is non-monetary measure, as I mentioned. So why we are talking about MPI? Because we have seen that there has been a general recognition in the uh, in intelligentsia that we should begin our conversations beyond extreme poverty. Up till now, we have only been concentrated highly on extreme poverty and how it has to be eradicated. But now the conversation has changed to a very good extent, where we are talking about, as I mentioned, multidimensionality of poverty, right? So these are the basic stylized facts that we can talk about. This is where the narratives are mostly flowing. However, very recent thing that we have noticed is that there has been a recent reversal of poverty reduction. By that, we mean that the poverty has actually unfortunately started increasing in certain pockets of the world, something that I focus on, and why that is happening. But one major lesson, and one something that can again be put as a stylized fact in a development economics textbook, is growth is often not resilient, and poverty reduction might not be sustainable. If we have achieved certain feats in poverty reduction, we should not be very happy with the fact that, okay, now it will keep on reducing only. Number one, the pace can fall. There is poverty reduction, but but at a slower pace. So the pace of poverty reduction can reduce. Number one. Number two, maybe the poverty start increasing instead of falling now. I'll come to that how. So these are the basic global trends, something that I've already mentioned, that 831 million people are living below 3 per person per day poverty line. This is a recent update in the poverty line, quite recent, because it has changed from 2000 in 2019 based on 2017 PPP, which was $1.9. From that, it changed to 2.15, and now currently we have $3, which is based on 2021 PPP, right? So, as I mentioned, in terms of headcount ratio, we know that 10% of the world population is living below poverty line. But again, I'll remind that this is extreme poverty. We are talking about very basic subsistence of food, clothing, and shelter. We are talking about when you enhance the concept of basic living or standards of living, you find that more and more people would be below poverty line. That's why, going back, we find that it is 1.1 billion people who are below poverty, right? So now if we look at the different regions, we find that 50% of the sub-Saharan African population is still living below poverty line. So no, we will say that in totality, there's only 10% of the population below poverty line globally. But in sub-Saharan Africa, things are much grimmer. We cannot just let ourselves let ourselves get swayed away with the general average, right? Because we have to see that's what's happening in different pockets. And 50% of the population is still under poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. They're living in extreme poverty conditions. And I'm not even talking about MPI here, because MPI data would be worse than this, right? So, and what we find is that over half of the 1.1 billion poor people are children. So because most of the population, so if you actually divide the population of the poor people, majority would be children, women, elderly people, and then others, right? So they are generally the vulnerable section. Even if it's a non-poor society, they are the vulnerable section. So if they are poor, it's a double jeopardy that they are facing, right? And we see that 27.9% of children live in poverty compared to only 13.5% of adults. Like it's almost, it's more than a half actually that we see here, right? Almost a half, not more than almost a half. So what do we find? We find that large proportions of people still lack basic sanitation, electricity, housing, cooking fuel, and we have huge numbers of those people, right? And maybe that would not look a lot because the world is huge and there's so many people. But that is where we need to be a little revisionary about our approach and see that how we are not deriving utility only out of the benefit of the masses, but also each and everyone's life is important. So even if there is one person left behind, I think our growth is not pro poor growth. So what we have seen, another recent development, it has been happening over the last 5 years, I can say more or less, is the new measures of poverty. This is something what my thesis has also been on, which is on societal poverty line. So what is societal poverty line? Up till now, World Bank has been using absolute poverty line. However, they realize that as countries are getting richer and extreme poverty is not a concern for many countries, and they are showing very good results when it comes to extreme poverty lines. Like India has shown very good results, China has shown very good results when it comes to extreme poverty line. We have shown very drastic reduction. However, it's not that we should be happy with the fact that okay, now only 10% or 2% of the Indian population is below poverty line as per the much recent estimates, or less than 2% actually. Rather, we have to change the way we are defining poverty. So this is the approach towards that, because poverty is the problem of two things. It's a problem of identification and problem of aggregation. So we need to change how we identify poor. We need to change our strategy in which we are identifying who is called poor. So that's what they are talking about here. They changed and brought something called hybrid poverty line, which is a combination of the absolute as well as relative aspects of poverty, because relative aspect of poverty is something which is very well used in Europe and the US. We are trying to bring it into a developing country context as well, because we know that India still doesn't have the problem of just food, water, shelter kind of situation. More than roti kapda makan, now the problem has increased, including access to internet, access to labor markets. Because if you don't have a decent pair of shoes or decent pair of clothes, maybe you cannot access the basic labor chalk that is right outside your home. So in this context, access to phone, internet, basic network services becomes quite important to have a decent living, right? To have a life without shame, as Amartya Sen would put it, right? Hence, we find that again, societal poverty line shows that the poverty has decreased, but not with as much extent as absolute poverty line would claim, because it's a more generous measure as well of identifying poor. So we see, as I mentioned, it is estimated as a maximum of the $2.15 and $1 plus 50% consumption expenditure. So $2.15 is taken into account. Now I think it can be updated to $3 with the recent update in poverty line. Why it has been put at $2.15? Because there are still situations where the poverty would be falling, the consumption would be falling below 2.15. That is below the poverty line, right? Hence, to keep a lowest threshold, we have put $2.15, the absolute poverty line. And then the second part of this equation uh, is the relative part of it, in which we see that the consumption, in which the poverty line changes as the median consumption changes, because I am comparing myself to what the median person consumes. So if I'm consuming less than half of the median consumption, then maybe I should be considered poor, right? In society. And also, an important part of it is it doesn't need any government to send its diktat and establish that this is how poverty should be defined. This is the fixed consumer basket. This basket would be defined as per the region you are talking about, as per the nation you are talking about, and would vary. And hence, poverty becomes more dynamic in its assessment. So we see, we have evidence from India that societal poverty has declined, but at a slower pace compared to the extreme poverty lines given by the Tendulkar estimates in India. And there is also another global evidence that we have. This evidence is true for the global level as well, the fourth and the fifth point, which is that the number of people identified as socially poor has declined, but only slightly compared to those in extreme poverty, right? Giving Indian evidence, what I find is that from the 2 decades of 1993 to 2012, India's societal poverty headcount ratio has declined, but by only 10% point. Whereas if you look at the absolute poverty, it was around 46%, which has fallen to 22%. So it has been more than 50% fall in the absolute standards, whereas only 10 percentage point falls in the relative standards, right? So as I mentioned, the rate of reduction is less than half of the rate of reduction seen using the official or Tendulkar estimates in India. This is the something that I've drawn using the PIP from the World Bank. So what we see here is that the global and regional societal poverty trend. So we see that the societal poverty has fallen. It is falling, which is a good news. But again, it's not as fast. If you look at the scale is not that at a lower level. The scale is still starting from 50%, 60%, and going all the way down to 10, 20%, not even 10%, between 20 to 30%. So it means that still a larger fraction of the population is living below societal poverty line. So even if we are happy that they are not under extreme poverty lines, we have to stop and think, because we need to change the way we are looking at societal power, change the way we are looking at absolute poverty, and redefine it, reimagine it, and bring relative aspects into picture to make it more contextually specific and contextually relevant, right? So that we see, because India is a major part of South Asia, so we see very similar trends between India and South Asia, that they are falling. Worldwide, we see there has been a little more societal poverty, which is almost coming out around 25%, though in India and South Asia, it is coming out to be around 21, 22%, like this, right? So again, a lot has to be covered. The gap between the x-axis and the graphs has to be reduced further. Now, one more evidence that we have is from our work. It's a working paper, and it was a part of my thesis work, in which we are talking about how poverty and labor markets interact, and how it has its interaction with inequality. So what do we find? We find that um, poverty impacts our work hours, and inequality impacts our work hours. So if the inequality in a society is increasing, people start working for longer hours because they want to keep up with the rest of the society, and it's a very unequal society. So the only way they can match their consumption level is by working for longer hours, earning more money, and hence participate in the society, right, and be at par with them. However, that is not true for the poor. What we find is that poor in general work for lesser hours compared to the non-poor. Whichever poor you're talking about, whether you're talking about poor as per the extreme poverty line or poor as per the societal poverty line, they work for lesser hours compared to the non-poor. Non-poor is anybody who cannot be considered poor by any of the definitions, right? So this is a little puzzling, that why poor are working for lesser hours. We all generally expect that poor should be working for longer hours compared to non-poor, number one. And this evidence that we are getting from India, that poor people are working for lesser hours compared to non-poor. So one conjecture, which is also very right-wing conjecture that we see across, is that poor people are lazy. They don't want to work for longer hours. They just want to live on subsidies or some kind of charity, and hence they're working for lesser hours. But when we test, we find that that's not true. They are not working for less hours because they don't want to, but because they show their willingness to work, but they are not able to match with the employment needs of the market. So that is a term that ILO also uses. It's called time-related underemployed. So they face time-related unemployment or time-related underemployment, in which they are expressing their willingness to work for longer hours, but they are not able to get job, and hence they are not, and hence they are time-related underemployed. They want to work for longer, but they're not able to. Coming to the to this part, what we find is that there has been, as I mentioned, another curious case of poverty reduction reversal. So recent forecasts of World Bank and other reports are mentioning that in countries like in South Asia and Africa, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Zimbabwe, Niger, and there are some more countries here and there, which are rather showing an increase in poverty. Up till now, they had been performing very well. Since the turn of the century, they have been consistently reducing their poverty till 2014, 15 something. But after that, something happened, that they have started showing rather an increase, or it's a kind of a U-shaped graph for the poverty, right? These are forecasts right now, but these forecasts are also based on some reality that this is definitely going to happen. I haven't put the numbers here, but the numbers are quite available, easily available on the World Bank page as well, right? So why that is happening? So what is the concern is that the decades of progress has been undone. From 1990 to 2014, more than a billion people were lifted out of extreme poverty worldwide. But again, things are changing now. This is where I think other measures of poverty become very important, not just headcount ratio, but also poverty gap ratio. These ratios, these kind of indicators give you an idea that how much they are away from the poverty line. And also, I think we need to test that even if you're non-poor, how much away are you from being poor or falling back to the poverty, below poverty line. And that is the vulnerability index that we generally talk about, that how vulnerable they are to falling into poverty. And most of the houses are just one climate shock away, they are just one floods away, or maybe one COVID kind of scenario away to fall back into the trap of poverty, right? So what we see is that 14 to 19, there has been a slowing of the growth. There has been a regression in the growth process, which can be attributed to pandemic. But also what we saw is the post-pandemic period, economies are growing very fast. There was a huge rate of, there was a huge employment drive. There was a very high rate of employment because that was all working on the base effect. Because economy already started with a slump, even a slighter change was bringing greater bang for the buck. Even a slightest economic activity was bringing greater bang for the buck. So there was increasing returns of scale that we were seeing, right? And hence, we see that economies were growing, all the tides were raising all the boats above the danger level, and it was all hunky-dory situation, but it could not sustain. Uh, Progress slowed in the post-pandemic period as well, when the base effect stopped working, because you can't have increasing returns to scale for the longest time. It can be exploited only to a limited extent. After that, they will come to constant and then declining returns, and that's what exactly happening. We see that in the pro-pandemic period, poverty has started rising again. All the poverty which had been controlled up till now, which has been reduced up till now, has again reversing. And there has been some aspect of the shifting geography of poverty as well, because the regions which were mostly affected by poverty have been changing over time. East Asia, Pacific region, they saw significant poverty reduction in the late 20th century, whereas Sub-Saharan Africa, the number of people in extreme poverty has only grown since 1990. They haven't changed. They haven't seen a lot of change. But what can be the reasons for that? That's why I call it the curious case of poverty reversals. And what is happening here? So the first thing that we need to understand, and I think this would be, yeah, my last slide here as well. So first of all, COVID-19 impact. So pre-pandemic, of course, all the achievements and attainments and sustainable development goals, etc., were taken down. Number one. Number two, the conflict economies that we are seeing these days. Recently, there was some conflict in Africa as well, in Sudan or somewhere. Before that, there has been conflict in Central Asia. There has been conflict in Uzbekistan, sorry, not Uzbekistan, Ukraine, and there has been conflict-ridden situations in Gaza, Palestine, that we all know of, right? There's nothing we do not know. And these conflict shocks, followed by the climate shocks, like Pakistan bore the double jeopardy. They had COVID, they had floods, so, and massive floods that they faced. So they were double jeopardy that they're facing, because of which more people were pulled into the pulled below the poverty line, right? The other problem that we are facing is the unemployment problem in all these countries. I can specifically talk about the South Asian economies of Pakistan and Bangladesh, is the rise of unemployment as well as people stuck in low paying jobs. Most of the youth and women, there are so many reports and news articles which are talking about that, how they are stuck in low paying service sector jobs, where the service sector is not adding any value. They are not doing high value services, but very low value services. Informal economy, I forgot to mention here, but informal economy in which they are stuck. And why informal economy is beginning? Because of lack of rural infrastructure. They do not have a good rural infrastructure in which people can bank on, from where they can get employment. Hence, they move to the urban sector. So the classic Harris-Tedero kind of model works here, where people move from rural areas to urban areas, and ultimately developing an informal sector in urban areas. And what is happening here is the problem of urban unemployment and different other problems that arise with unemployment, like poverty and different vices related to unemployment that come up there. And at the same time, what we see is there is a clear disinterest in developing rural infrastructure. Hence, rural poverty is falling at a slower pace as well. It is falling, but at a much slower pace, because there is no development of rural infrastructure. And as they have also mentioned in their it is mentioned in the literature, that the only solution for urban unemployment and urban congestion is rural development. You can't do, because you have done enough, you can't do more in the urban areas to improve the condition. To improve urban areas, you have to go back to the rural areas, and the solution lies in the alternative. Improving the rural areas so that people would have less incentive to migrate and congest other places, right? Coming back to the last point is that the reason for reversal of poverty are again systemic political economy issues like elite capture, which is quite often than not seen in Pakistan, where we see military and clergy taking more prominent role than the democratically, if at all, democratically elected representatives. Corruption, another big problem which has led to recent rise in the uprising of Nepal or Bangladesh and Pakistan for that matter, as well as patronage politics, which is also seen in those in terms of teacher absenteeism in Pakistan. What happens is that uh, you would not see many teachers in school. There is a huge case of teacher absenteeism, and where are they found? They are found mostly helping some clergy or some local politicians in getting elections, so in helping in winning elections. So all these kind of patronage politics are ultimately driving down the policies and the growth that could have happened. And these systemic issues were there earlier as well. Why reversal is happening now? Because they tried to cover these systemic issues with some injection of growth. However, now the dosage is over and it's not working anymore. And unemployment problems are not getting solved. The rural urban divide is not getting solved. And hence, these systemic issues take over because they have never gone before for that matter. They were never swept away. So they again come to the forefront and start again bringing the vices that they come with, like extreme poverty, inequality, unemployment, etc. Yeah, so that was all from my side. I will hand it over to Prachi, because now Prachi would be discussing more from the Indian perspective. I've given more of the global and Asian perspective, but now we'll have more from Indian perspective. Do we have any questions right now? Because I might have to leave for a class in next 10 minutes or so. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Akansh. I think, yeah, okay, maybe I'll see. There are no questions at the moment
Sure.
on the chat, but I will mention if anyone has a question, please you can just kind of put it in the chat. If we can take that before Akansh will leave, then if not, we will pass the questions on afterwards.
Yeah, sure. They can always email me as well. That won't be an issue. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Right. So thank you so much. That was really nice. I enjoyed the talk. Actually, I learned some things. Your working paper, where you showed that poor people actually, tend to have lesser working hours, and not because of laziness, but because of the mismatch in job opportunities, sounds very, very interesting. I haven't thought about this this way before. Okay, we're going to have Professor Prachi Bansal. She is an assistant professor of economics at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. Her research focuses on agriculture, labor markets, and economic development, combining rigorous data analysis with extensive field work across different Indian states. She has previously worked with the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, in Thailand, and the International Labour Organization, ILO, in Geneva, contributing to projects on rural labor, gender, and sustainable development. And her work explores how data and technology can inform inclusive policy solutions. At the GSGP, she teaches courses on machine learning, Python programming, statistics, and leads initiatives to make quantitative education a lot more accessible to everybody. And I would like to welcome my very good friend, the Professor Prachi, to take the floor.
Thank you, Chisholm, for that extremely wide introduction. And thank you, Akansh, for the presentation. It really set the ground for what I am planning to do. Um, so, okay, so basically the way I have, let me share the presentation, but the way I have structured it, because so I do teach a course on poverty and inequality, and I really find it difficult to concisely put everything in 20 minutes. So what I have done here is to start with some little bit of stylized facts, and then talk about basically capturing the idea of deprivation and not just income poverty. Talk about the various aspects that Akash touched, but with respect to India. So Let me just share the presentation first. Yeah, so I would perhaps like to start on this note that if perhaps poverty is declining, which is now becoming a big issue, that do we even have poverty in India? That's a question being raised because of the kind of data that we have, which is showing that there is a decline. But if it is declining on paper, but there's lived deprivation, perhaps we are asking the wrong questions and we are poking the data the wrong way. So I would like to begin with a few things which are some markers of poverty which can be clearly shown. So let me start with the state of agriculture. And this is very recent data. This is year 2023, and your National Crime Records Bureau data shows that suicides, which represent, the person has finally is in a situation where they've given up, they're not fighting anymore. This is the toll, the number that you have, which is around 11,000 deaths in the agriculture sector alone, of which of the differentiation is very important to notice. About 40% farmers and 60% are agriculture laborers. So agriculture labor is like mostly people who are landless, and that is the kind of death toll that you are looking at, the suicides. And an interesting fact about these numbers is that between after COVID, there has been a rise in since 2018. Actually, there has been a rise in farmer suicides, barring the year 2019, and there has been a rise particularly for the suicides of agriculture laborers. So, which also shows us that what is the situation of the people in the at the bottom most part of the ladder. And there is, of course, a varied geographical distribution. States which are otherwise more advanced, like Maharashtra and Karnataka, are having reporting the highest number of farmer suicides and even agricultural labor suicides. The post-COVID situation is extremely worse, and so this is one clear marker that these this is probably the data that we should look at when we are looking at poverty, instead of just looking at the poverty line and the measurements thereof. Let me give you another very important number, which is basically the prevalence of undernourishment. And if you look at the statistical, there's a measure, and I'll not go get into the statistical definition of it, but just broadly speaking, prevalence of undernourishment is estimated as the probability that the calorie intake for a representative individual is below the minimum dietary energy requirement that they need. And we calculated this number for India, where the official estimates are at 15%. In that, there 15% is the prevalence of undernourishment in India of the total population. But if you account for the differences in the calorie requirement because of the people's age, their occupation, their their sex, etc., you will find that I mean, we did this exercise based on the National Statistical Survey data that 39% of India is undernourished. So the prevalence of undernourishment is 39% based on the 2011 numbers, and the it's about 472 million people who we are talking about, who are not meeting their, in very simple terms, who are not meeting their basic minimum dietary energy requirements. And that number tells us something, that this is the situation. Of course, hunger and this situation has worsened, particularly after COVID. In terms of what is happening in agriculture, and because we want to speak about what are the policy solutions that you can provide for tackling these issues, and because the slide clearly has the agriculture suicides, I want to talk about the major dilemma that the agriculture sector is facing, that your input costs are rising. And the problem is that your output is not selling for the prices that can give you a reasonable return. We are certainly nowhere near the point where we could see doubling of farmers' incomes. In fact, the incomes are extremely poor, and to make the point come home, I'm just trying to show you. So if farmers use multiple inputs, one of the crucial inputs that farmers depend on for their yield is fertilizers. And I've worked over the last several years on fertilizers. So I want to show you quickly some data points that makes the point about what is happening there. And the story is very similar for the other in seeds and pesticides as well, where you have a high corporatization. So there is a nutrient-based subsidy policy that the government has, but primarily what has happened is that they have decontrolled the prices of fertilizers, especially control as in. So we have three major fertilizers in India. This is urea, DAP, and MOP. That is the potash, the phosphate, and your nitrogen. And right now, the nitrogen that is contained in urea is statutorily controlled by the government, but the others are decontrolled, that the companies can set whatever prices up to a certain limit. And we see that once this policy was introduced, the prices of the potash increased from something like 4,500 rupees per ton to 36,000 per ton. So a many-fold increase that happened in potash prices. Similarly, for your phosphate, you can see the prices rose from 9,350 rupees per ton to more than 27,000 per ton between these areas. It was in the small period of time. And right now, it's only urea which is statutorily controlled. Now, many people say that you should, nitrogen. There is too much of nitrogen in Indian soils. There's too much of nitrogen in Indian soils, and you should have other nutrients. And there's this problem of urea bias happening. But as you can clearly see, this problem is uh, of the kind of policy that we have. We are giving only urea at a controlled rate, and both the other fertilizer inputs have become extremely expensive, especially for the poor farmers. And that is why they have no choice but to use more urea, and therefore you have more urea bias or nitrogen bias happening in the soil. And to even argue for saying that, remove the fertilizer and move towards organic farming, that involves a huge amount of cost. That is not the kind of, there's no investment being given for that from the public sector, from the government or the state to make that move. So what I'm trying to say here is look at the kind of input policy that you have, and despite all of this, I would like to show that there's too big of a problem of shortage of fertilizers. In fact, I'm currently working on a piece in which this problem has actually aggravated in the last 1 year. Post COVID, the availability of these fertilizers has been perpetually falling. You can see that these are the on the left side, these are the queues of people standing to get the fertilizer input. And on the right side, I've given you some very simple numbers which shows that compared to 2019, and the reason I'm comparing it to 2019 is because it's a pre-COVID situation. So compared to 2019, you'll see the availability of DAP month by month in January was 40% less. And there were several months, whereas in August and September, which are the prime months where you need DAP, the availability was 70 to 75% less. So even though you could have afforded these at an exorbitant prices, they were not simply available, and there was too much of black marketing and hoarding happening for these fertilizer inputs. And this is the reality that the farmers are facing in our country, that you have very high input costs, and there's a persistent shortfall that is there. And I would like to show you that compare. So these are the months. Let me just enlarge the figure. So these are the months on the bottom, and you will see that this figure is so this is basically showing you the availability of DAP in 2020 to till 2023 compared to 2019. If it is below the x-axis, below the zero line, it basically shows the shortfall. And if it is above, it is the only those 2 months when it was higher. So consistently, you will see DAP is short in availability compared to what we require for farming. And this is the same, I have not put these graphs here, but The same is the situation for your potash, and very similar for urea also, where you are facing a crisis. Um, and despite all of this, the prices are rising, and you are in a situation where the state of agriculture is getting worse because of the high input costs that are there. The seeds again are corporatized. Similar is the case with pesticides, where there's no formal regulation, and you have all kinds of pesticides in the market. Now, coming to the, because Akash touched on this idea of vulnerability because of climate, I also want to make a point about a few stylized facts here. So there's this very interesting climate vulnerability that was calculated by the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and they found that 80% of Indians live in districts which are highly vulnerable to extreme hydro met disasters like flood, droughts, and cyclones. And let me just give you some very basic numbers that will set the stage for what kind of and this is not just inequality. This is also basic levels of deprivations are very high for these areas. So 65% of people who are living in the rural areas are actually highly dependent on climate sensitive sectors, particularly agriculture. You have rural communities facing very erratic monsoons, and urban communities facing heat stress and flooding, although having better infrastructure. And then there's this whole urban poor, slum dwellers, outdoor laborers who are highly vulnerable to climate change. And those of us who are like in Jindal right now, and we are, the Sonipat and Delhi NCR area, we know what happens in the month of November and how difficult it is to breathe the air here. The so what the point to make is that it's not just the fact that climate is affecting everyone equally. That is not the case. Poor households have a much lower resilience. They cannot afford air conditioners, water filters, relocation. Uh, those possibilities that you relocate from Delhi to other areas is in the month of November, December is not a possibility for poor households. There's there's these wealthier households and companies which are can invest in private flood defenses. They can have crop insurance. They can absorb losses. And rich families also have, if they are struck with a disaster, to rebuild. But the poor families often go into debt. And that's an important, because that debt is a continuous vicious cycle that they enter into. Similarly, the pollution impact. The wealthier households can be shielded, but lower income groups face disproportionately higher health burdens, which then perpetuate their the health inequality, the expenditures that they incur further. Also, this is very important to note that the caste-based inequalities also play an important role in the climate vulnerability. Uh, Basically, it's if you were to geographically map, the lower caste and indigenous communities often live in very drought-prone areas or very flood-prone riverbanks, and having a climate shock there affects them more. Similarly, women are affected more because most of rural India, this collection of fuel, water, and other additional burdens is taken up by women. This and there are reports which talk about how gender-based violence can itself rise after the climate disasters. I would give you some case studies as well, but just to broadly talk about this, the vulnerability to storms in coastal areas. So, in recently, Odisha's storm, which was called Fani, and it struck about 15 million people, which was in 2019. And it was primarily the poor rural and coastal community people who bore the brunt of this disaster. And while the wealthy could sustain from their past savings from their concrete homes, which is an important point to be noted, but the poor were completely reliant on government support. Similarly, you have a situation of uh, limited livelihoods in areas like Himachal Pradesh, in areas like Uttarakhand, where people's livelihood is restricted to agriculture and tourism, and such climate disasters, make them make challenge their livelihood as well. The same issue is happening in the case of dryland regions, where you have chronic water scarcity and frequent droughts that are contributing to the agrarian crisis and farmer suicides, because water is becoming a challenge. There is a groundwater depletion that is happening and that is exacerbating the issues. Coming to the urban areas, and we know in cities like Delhi, where extreme heat was noted in the last year, and hazardous air quality, we already have estimates that the poor is suffering from disproportionate health impacts, and the wealthy can therefore afford air purifiers. But this is the situation that we have in terms of the difference in the climate, the difference in the climate vulnerability of the poor and the rich. Now, I so these were some of the issues that bring to the fore that point that you cannot just look at the poverty numbers and ignore all of these issues. I want to basically drive the point home to just using a few graphs about the kind of price difference that you look at in between the poor and the rich. And this point is important because poor people's basket is primarily food. 60% of their basket is food. So I want to talk about what is happening there. And let me just, so this is from the work that I did on measuring food, measuring inflation inequality. Now, why is this important for understanding poverty is also because um, what I'm going to show now is that though poor and rich do not face very different inflation rates, you can see the blue line is the blue line is the poor, the red line is the rich, and the black line is the average Indian household. And the rates are somewhat different. The inflation rates are somewhat different, but they're not. Sometimes the poor is facing high inflation, sometimes the rich is facing high inflation. We cannot make out a trend, that who is facing higher prices. That is something that we can't, generalize from this. But let me show you this graph, which drives the point home that in the bottom of the x-axis, what you see is households range from poorest to the richest. So 0 to 5 is the poorest household, 95 to 100 is the richest household. And these lines are showing you what is happening to the coefficient of variation of inflation. So let me just put it very simply, what is happening to the volatility of inflation. And you look at this, the volatility of inflation is going down and down and down as you move from the poorest to the richest. And I would like you to look at the red line, which is the food inflation. This red line is clearly showing you that, and so is the blue, the headline inflation, that poor is facing very high volatility of inflation compared to the rich. And as you become richer, your volatility of inflation actually goes down. Now, the important thing is, and the volatility can be measured. So what I've done here is basically measured the volatility as variability of the monthly inflation from the average annual inflation for a particular year. But uh, why is this volatility of inflation bad for the poor? That's an important question to think. And I can give you two reasons. So, a high inflation volatility would basically mean that the expectation of the poor people always remain unanchored. So, what happens is that because poor strata of the population cannot defer their consumption so much, because most of their consumption is necessities, and they cannot defer it so much, or they cannot plan it so much, the regardless of the price volatility, they have to incur a certain level of expenditure. As a result, even with the high volatility of inflation, they are forced to consume, unlike the rich who can plan or who can defer their consumption if the prices are rising. Also, the other important thing is that poor are more credit constrained, and that is becoming a major issue as per the All India Debt and Investment Survey. 35% of rural households in India and 22% of urban households in India were in debt. And primarily, this debt came from non-institutional sources, meaning that there was usurious interest rates, very high interest rates that they were paying. And primary reason for taking the debt were consumption reasons. So reasons like education, medical treatment, housing, consumption expenditure, marriage. These were the prime reasons that you had to take a debt. And these figures clearly illustrate that households who are indebted to meet consumption expenditure are more vulnerable to volatility in inflation. To just last 2 points that I want to make here is that if we look at the proportion of, so this is about the consumer price index basket on which your poverty lines are also based, that how what is the proportion of different items for the poorest and for the richest people, and then the average, you'll see that most of this is comprising of food. And so what I have done is that I wanted to look at, is it the case that the food prices faced by the rich and the poor are different? The food inflation faced is different. So let me just very quickly explain this last graph. And this graph is basically showing you, so there's a zero line, there's an x-axis zero line, and then there are negative numbers on the y-axis, and then you can see that these are the CPI food and beverage is the whole uh, the CPI food and beverage that you see here is the full group, and then there are sub products like cereals, meats, oils, pulses, etc. And what I have done is I've examined the inflation gap for the richest, between the richest and the poorest household. That is the top 5% of the households and the bottommost 5% of the households across all the major food groups from 2015 to 2024. Just subtracted the inflation numbers. And what I see here is very interesting, that if ever you see that this number is above the x-axis, the lines are above the x-axis, it basically means that the richer household have faced a higher inflation. But if you see the numbers are below the x-axis, the lines are below the x-axis, like here in oils and fats, you see, it basically means that the poor is facing a heavier inflation burden. Like for them, the inflation is higher. And values, if they are closer to zero, they basically mean that the disparity is very less, that more or less everybody faces similar levels of prices. Now, the point that I want to make here, look at cereals and products. You will see that it's more or less at the zero line. Whereas if we go by the data, 19% of the basket of the poor is cereal, 19%. And for the rich, it's only 4%. Now, what is driving this result that they are having very similar inflation patterns is also the fact that though cereal comprise a very big part of the poor's basket, the public distribution system has enabled this particular um, this kind of distribution where they're shielded from the inflation burden, the kind of inflation shock, the market volatility, because by providing these cereals at a highly subsidized rate, the PDS is acting as a buffer against the market price volatility. And it this makes it very clear that this is actually the case when you look at cereals. Whereas please look at the things like vegetables. Now, in case of vegetables, if you see, vegetables constitute around 10% of the poor's basket. And for the rich, it's only about 3%. So 10% and 3%, the first difference is this. But if you look at here, there are many cases where you will see that the vegetable, the that the line goes down, and it goes down as high as -10 in terms like in particularly in years like COVID years. where you are looking at a -10. Similarly, in oils and fats, you see a downfall, which clearly shows in the years of supply side shocks, in the years of COVID crisis, we are looking at the picture where poor is facing a much higher inflation gap than the rich. And the gap is as high as a -14 percentage point in 2021. Pulse is also similar situation. It's either zero, or there are these gaps where the dip is higher for the poor. Um, but look at CPI food and beverage, the aggregate index. If you look at the aggregate index, these high dips that you saw in oils and fats and vegetables are masked, completely masked in CPI food and beverage, which makes the point that basically our paper shows that CPI basket has a plutocratic bias. In other words, it is showing an anti-poor bias. The way the basket is constructed, the index disproportionately is reflecting the consumption patterns of the higher spending households, those who are spending on fruits, those who are spending on meat and fish, etc. But it is not showing you the pattern of the poor households. That's an important finding of this. I don't know how well could I have communicated this in the in this little time, but uh, and imagine that people who argue for taking out PDS, if you were to actually take out PDS, the stability that you see in cereals and products will go away, and that will further exacerbate the volatility of the poor. And here, therefore, there's a point to be made that these kind of um policy measures are extremely important to make sure that the poor are insulated from price shocks. And that drives home the point again that similarly for fertilizers, the having a decontrolled fertilizer price regime does not work, especially one which is so lopsided that you are um, giving control to urea and not to the other fertilizers. So these were some of the broad um, things that I thought maybe I can touch upon, and then we can maybe take on these things separately. Just to for the references, what I've used in this is for the things about climate, I've referred to the CEW report. For the work on inflation inequality, I have referred to my own work, which is published in the World Inequality Lab, and it's called Inflation Inequality Measurement of Measuring Inflation Inequality in India. And for the work on fertilizer, again, it's coming from my own paper, and I can provide the link to the paper if needed. Yes. Thank you, Jason. Yes.
Wow, fantastic. Oh, that's so lovely. Thank you so much, Professor Prachi. That was really good. Right. I think I'm ready to take some questions. So if there are any audience members that have any questions, you can feel free to ask the questions now. And you could also write it in the chat or in the Q&A box if you wanted. But while we wait for this, maybe I will ask one or two questions myself. So you really spoke about agriculture being so important, super important for poverty reduction, ostensibly because majority of the poor people are engaged in this field. I would like to pick your brains on what you think could be the most or easiest paths out of poverty for people who are in the agricultural sector. I mean, of course, taking into consideration climate change that is completely decimating a lot of their output, and the fact that many young people don't want to go into agriculture these days. What ways do you think we can kind of find a solution to the problem?
Okay. So can I answer, or you want to ask?
Yeah, please. I mean,
Okay. So Chisholm, let me just go back to, so my thesis was on labor absorption in agriculture. And what I found was that labor absorption in agriculture, as you were just saying, the people don't want to go into agriculture work, has fallen over the years. That is a clear thing that we can see for across all the crops. But it has not fallen consistently in all the regions. So, for example, in Eastern India, you will still see that there is high labor use in agriculture. So there is high employment opportunities there, but not so much in, say, Haryana, or not so much in Punjab, where a lot of technological intervention has happened. And so what needs to be done is also to understand how are we disseminating this technology, and can there be a way to introduce those crops which can deal with several problems at a time. So, for example, moving away from the wheat paddy monoculture can enable you to grow crops which are more labor absorbing, which can also solve the problem of employment, and thereby can have those multiplier effects. But the question is, why are the farmers not diversifying? Simply because your policies, the MSP, the minimum support prices, are primarily for the paddy and wheat. There's very little procurement of any other crop, almost no procurement of any other crop. And that is an important policy intervention that can be done, that the correct incentives to grow those crops should be provided. And that requires a MSP, that the clear demand that farmers are having on a higher MSP, which is say 2 plus 50%, that kind of demand should be taken care of. And I think that can really help to absorb more labor, also solve the problems of, say, for example, groundwater depletion that is happening in Haryana or in Punjab, where an excess amount of paddy and wheat is being grown. So that clearly is one area where that kind of change can happen, and it can help. Again, to just balance both sides of in controlling the input prices and assuring a higher return is something that we really need for the farmers at the moment. It's not Most of our agriculture, more than 80% of our farmers are small farmers, and they are technically what you call as the net buyers of food. So it's important that the prices remain controlled, because ultimately they buy the food that most of them are growing in isolation.
Very great. Thank you. Okay, so let me see. Are any of our attendees having questions? Unfortunately, Akansh had to leave. So, okay, maybe we can just keep having a conversation and then see what happens. I
Yes.
mean,
Yeah.
yeah, so I mean, in terms of how poverty is measured, I think there was something very interesting from your presentation where you were talking about suicide rates and
Yeah.
how, that is, I mean, many people, when they are trying to talk about poverty, they never, go to those kind of statistics. They always look for something else in terms of
Right.
income or whatever. I think that was very interesting. I think Akansh also mentioned something similar where he was looking at relative poverty, societal whatever, benchmark. Well, yeah, I mean, do you think that the way that we are currently thinking about poverty is actually the best way to do it? We have of course the multidimensional index and other things like this, but do you think that there are things we can add or in different ways that we can look at it apart from what we currently have? Is there, like, in terms of measurement,
I
what do you?
think, yes. Okay, so one is that what has happened, and this is what Professor Patnaik's argument is also, that we have somewhere down the line forgotten the difference between calorie measurement and the income measurement, and that is kind of important to look at. So calorie measurement had its own importance, and over time, what has happened is we are saying that the requirement of calories itself has fallen. So therefore, because the requirements has fallen, you can now calculate poverty, which is giving you results which are lower numbers. And that is that is but again, it just looks at nutritional poverty. It is not looking at other things. So it is not looking at the income measures. So those measures, irrespective of the problems that they have, are important to drive the point about one particular kind of poverty that you are looking at. The the things that I spoke about become all the more important because these are lived experiences. These are experiences which are, so it's like looking at two different measures altogether, where because inequality and poverty are coming into play. And we cannot look at these, those statistical measures have their own importance. But I think if you are not looking at the progress in these other indicators, so I think Jean Drèze has a very interesting piece where he's looking at what is happening to real wages, and he showed that real wages are falling. So how can you say poverty is declining? So when your data is not giving you the reality, I think these are important metrics to look at. Having said that, I would not think that let's put all of them together and put some index and call it multidimensional index and let's calculate that. Because I don't think those indices capture the issues, the vulnerability that women have, or certain people from certain caste would have, or the caste class differences. And so I think these are two separate things with each of them having their own merits. But making these multidimensional poverty indices, I don't particularly like the idea of doing that and saying that, these three things, roti, kapda, makan, the most important. So let's talk about just this and not talk about the other issues. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me as well. I was teaching a course on poverty, and I think, going over the food calorie poverty line, and we're like, okay,
Yes.
1,500 kilocalories per day. If you're not able to afford this in a day, then you're poor. And then all the students were like, well, I don't even eat this much. So does it mean
Yeah.
that I'm officially poor? Like,
Right.
I
Right.
mean, so you're like, okay, so we have to really rethink what we're really saying.
Right.
And yeah, I also, your idea of lived experiences is really important, because poverty is not really just about how much money you have in your bank, or if you
Yeah.
have money or not. But really, I mean, there's so many things. For example, the dignity of life. I
Also,
mean,
yeah, if you are
yeah.
able to insulate, so for example, the climate change right now, if you are able to insulate from it because you have the money and you can think of other measures, you have concrete homes, but the poor
Mm,
people don't, that is something
yeah.
which has to be, and this is not things that the indices are capturing.
Mm,
So
yes.
I think those issues thereby become very important.
Mm. Okay, so maybe before we go, I'll ask you the big question. If if today you are Prime Minister of India, you won the election, and somehow you're in the office, what is
Okay.
the big thing? What will you do? Like, what is that big action you will take that you think will solve this, at least cut it down by half? I mean, what is the biggest thing you think that could be done from a policy perspective?
So to bring what to half,
I
because
mean,
according to
okay,
the according to our
let's
PM, there is no poverty. So there's the so but if yes, if from our perspective, if I have to look at things, I think because agriculture is one sector which is employing the highest number of people in absolute sense, and that is an area where we really need some major reforms, in particular, and not the kind of reforms that they were trying to bring by farm laws, the just the opposite kind, where you can have some state controls, where you can, and also, um, so globally, what is happening right now with the tariff war situation, that is something that has to be done to you protect uh, more of the farmers, and then let this sort of grow. And maybe growth of the agriculture sector is a key way to lift people out of poverty, and that growth should not happen through the means of corporatization of agriculture. That is not the that is not the way forward, that move towards contract farming and move towards more and more open kind of thing. It's more of an internal, but that requires a big political will to move towards that kind of thing, where you are giving state controlled seeds and fertilizers and inputs and giving a assurance of a high prices, and the procurement is moving in the correct direction, the APMCs are working in a manner in which they work. And and thereby you can have, the also the Lewisian model then can work well when people move out of agriculture and they go to industry. There needs to be an impetus to build industry. So for example, the manufacturing units, and we compare it with China. We know that the factories there are so large. You have factories which can employ 5,000 workers, and India has a surplus of workers. So there is a possibility to increase our scale of production. The make in India can really happen in a more better manner than what is happening right now. So I think sector-wise, a plan has to be made on what can be done, and plans are important. The planning commission and the way they worked in terms of what is needed, that really is important in terms of moving towards a growth which is sustainable, which I don't think is happening at the moment. It's very ad hoc, and we have estimates from Piketty, etc., that inequality is the worst in India at this moment. So you have a growth of billionaires and not a growth in the poorest of the poor people. So I think yes, those the other thing that I would probably think of is the NREGA program should be strengthened. That's a program that people need in India, and the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. And unfortunately, with very low wages, even with those low wages, people are working there, which demanding that work, which shows the levels of poverty that they are facing. So we need to strengthen that program. We need to increase the wages there, and we can make that work align with the climate changes. I mean, it's too big a question, Chisholm. You get to think about
Yes.
all that you can do.
Well,
It's
that's a very good attempt. Actually, we have one question in the comments, so maybe I will take it.
yes.
He or she says, apologies if this is a misunderstanding of the graphs, but in what circumstances could inflation volatility be higher for the rich, as shown in the minor movements in the graphs, shown in the last slide on inflation gap for different subgroups of food? So I think she's asking about the last graph that you showed about inflation gap. In what circumstances could inflation volatility actually be higher for the rich?
So
So I
that
think there
one
are
is
some
not food
crops.
inflation volatility. That one is actually food inflation, only food inflation. And food inflation can be higher for the rich compared to the poor at any given year for any given thing. But what my paper shows is that consistently volatility for the poor in food and even otherwise in headline inflation has been consistently higher than the rich. So poor, it's always has been anti-poor. Um, yeah.
I guess there were some food groups like the fruit and the I don't know which other one, meat or something, where the rich kind of had a
So
more
that is not volatility,
sharp
Chisholm. That is
inflation. Yeah.
just the inflation gap.
Mm.
That is just inflation of the rich minus the inflation of the poor. And that, of course, can be higher. You can have a situation where the prices of meat for the rich can be higher compared to the poor. That is a possibility.
Okay.
What I wanted to show from that particular graph was that when you see the dip for vegetables and for oils and fats, where the dip goes very low, it is not going very low for the CPI overall,
Mm.
which makes the point that CPI overall does not capture the food and beverages, does not capture the spending patterns of the poor.
Okay. I hope this answered your question. Who had asked it? If this is still unclear, please you can.
Yeah, or maybe I can just quickly show a slide if it's possible.
Yeah.
Should I?
Yes, you could.
Okay. So let me just show this thing. Look at the volatility of food inflation, and 0 to 5 means the poorest, 95 to 100 means the richest. So just look at for each year, you will see 0 to 5. This light blue is the high one, and the dark blue is small in size. Consistently for all the years, you will see this. The black is average household, which means that food inflation volatility has consistently been higher for the poor than the rich. But if your question was why is this meat and fish higher? I mean, what is driving this? And this is not volatility. This is just the difference in inflation.
Okay.
Hmm.
Okay. Are there any other queries? If there are none, I think we'll probably kind of wrap it up. Right. So we want to thank our panelists. This was a very enlightening discussion. I learned a lot, actually, myself, very thought-provoking. What we have heard today reinforces the idea that poverty is not really just about the economics of it or about systems, how we, but it has to do with, systemic thinking. How do we measure it? How do we distribute stuff in terms of the equality or inequality? And how do we care for people? Like, this is the lives of people. They are not just numbers. They are not just, statistics. These are real people. How do we show, care to people who are at the lower end of the ladder? And as our title says, we must go beyond the breadlines, beyond just nominal measurements, beyond short-term relief, and we must think about lasting empowerment for people who need it the most. There must be a blend. It would require a blend of innovation, compassion, and political will to get this over the line. So on behalf of the ideas team, I would like to thank the organizing team, all the admins. I would like to thank once again the speakers, Professor Prachi and Professor Akansh, for their very amazing talks. And I hope that when next we invite them, they will be very willing to also come and share with us again. And I just want to dedicate today, World Poverty Day, to everyone who continues to research, who continues to teach, to work on these issues, to make poverty a part of our history and not the future. And yeah, both in theory and in practice. So thank you all for also joining, everyone who has joined. We are so glad to have you join us. Thank you very much. And yeah,
Thank you,
bye-bye.
Jason.